Good evening, goeienaand, fellow South Africans. From a warm Brisbane, and I know what was supposed to be my live stream is early, but I might as well play it now, seeing that I can't use live stream, and I explained that in the last video. Okay, tonight we're going to be looking at the dangers of land expropriation without compensation. And just to start with, it was this recent public comment by Julius Malema that inspired this presentation. Here we go.
When we live here, you see any beautiful piece of land, you like it, occupy it.
Okay. That is pretty scary stuff, okay? But let's continue. Okay. In Malema's own words, and the full quote is, if you see any beautiful piece of land, you like it, you occupy it, and it belongs to you. Okay? That's word verbatim what he told his supporters. Malema is an idiot, and one only has to look at that strategy of land occupation that imploded the entire Zimbabwean economy not so long ago. But Malema's words are what China wants to hear, watching the South African economy implode and making the country beholden to them. The reason I've concentrated on China in my videos earlier this week. When the rand collapses, there is no way that South Africa will be able to pay its debt back to China. That's when they will take over key assets like ports and airports. If you look at my recent videos, you'll see this point demonstrated in other countries. Let's look at land expropriation without compensation. First of all, if we accept that this is... Excuse me a second. Okay. First of all, if we accept that this is going to happen, because apparently it is, the land grab should be only on land that is not currently being farmed. To take away productive farms from the farmer is suicidal, as starvation will surely follow. Not only that, but I have no doubt that Boers who have had generations of living on a particular farm are not going to give it up without a fight. So civil war is a distinct possibility, making me think of Zuidlanders, who've got about 130,000 members, apparently. Now, South Africa needs to have the facts and knowledge at its fingertips on how it intends to proceed with its planned land reform program, headlined by the expropriation of land without compensation. The current land ownership structure, as well as sustainable funding models, should also be put in place to prop up new African farmers if the country's land reform is to be a success story. Currently, South African banks, who are turning their backs on their old white customers, are now working on a funding option for new African farmers. Neglecting a careful strategy will tip South Africa into the pitfalls of Zimbabwe's land reform program in 2000. Which led to a nosedive in agricultural productivity. Say farmers in the agricultural hub of Karoi, west of Harare. Moses Chibaya, a Zimbabwean tobacco and grain farmer, said, "There is need for knowledge and strong financial base and technical expertise before South Africa embarks on the reform program it intends to kickstart." Now he's a Zimbabwean, he should know, because he's been there. And he goes on to say, the program must have a clear plan of how the land will be redistributed. There is no need to give big tracts of land to black farmers just for the sake of giving land. People have to be productive if the economy is not going to be disturbed, he added. Okay, Pretty incisive stuff. Now, the South African Parliament motion allowing for land expropriation without compensation has caused an outcry both inside and outside the country. Zimbabwe walked the same path under Mugabe, whose radical and populist policies have lowered Zimbabwe into prolonged economic failure. However, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who has taken over from Robert Mugabe as president, wants to address this through paying compensation to white commercial farmers who lost their land. So Zimbabwe suddenly wants its white farmers back. I wouldn't be going there for quids. They might just pull that trick again. Consider the direct impact that land grabs in Zimbabwe had on that country's currency. Let's have a look at the video. Okay, here we go.
Hey guys, I'm going to be presenting a brief summary of the Zimbabwe 2008 hyperinflation event. This event it's not exactly common knowledge, but it's commonly known, especially in the truth community, because it happened so recently, about 5-6 years ago, so it's fairly recent. In Zimbabwe, prices doubled every 24 hours in November 2008, and inflation reached levels of exponential percentages. They eventually stopped using the official currency and switched to the South African rand, or the US dollar. A loaf of bread ended up costing $35 million. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe was one of the few instances that resulted in the abandonment of the local currency. At independence of 1980, the Zimbabwe dollar was worth about $1.25 US dollars. Afterwards, however, rampant inflation and the collapse of the economy severely devalued the currency. Inflation was steady before Robert Mugabe in '98 began a program of land reforms that primarily focused on taking land from white farmers and redistributing those properties and assets to black farmers, which disrupted food production and caused revenues from export of food to plummet. The result of that, to pay the expenditures, Mugabe's government and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed more and more banknotes with higher face values, just like that. Inflation began early in the 21st century, reaching 624% in '04. It fell back to low triple digits before surging to a new high of 1,730% in '06. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe revalued on August 1st, 2006 at a ratio of 1,000 Zimbabwe dollars to each second dollar. But year-to-year inflation rose by June 2007 to 11,000%, and larger denominations were issued. Inflation by July 16th officially surged to 2,200,000%. On August 1st, 2008, the Zimbabwe dollar was redenominated at a ratio of 1,010 to each third dollar. On August 19th, 2008, official figures announced for June estimated the inflation over 11,250,000%. Zimbabwe's annual inflation was 231 million%. Prices were doubling every 17 days. In its November 2008 peak, Zimbabwe's rate of inflation approached but failed to surpass Hungary's, who had the world record of inflation in July 1946. So, here's some Zimbabwe currency I picked up. $100 trillion bank reserve note and a $50 trillion bank reserve note. Basically,
Nearly 20 years after taking over land from white farmers and parceling it out to black farmers, Zimbabwe is still struggling to stabilize agricultural productivity. Mnangagwa argues that land reform is not reversible, but he wants to he wants to bank on the knowledge, assistance, and experience of the former commercial farmers. Ironically, Zimbabwe is welcoming white farmers back today. Other farmers in Zimbabwe say there are a number of factors which include lack of knowledge and experience, lack of financing or support from the government, and lack of support by banks, which is holding back productivity. The costs of inputs in Zimbabwe is too high compared to the prices in the region. The other issue is lack of market. Remember, at some point farmers would deliver grain and never get paid. Lack of machinery and use of poor quality seeds and failure to use better farming practices are all major contributors to our situation, said an experienced farmer in Resapi in the Manicaland province. Only 300 commercial farmers remain in Zimbabwe today, significantly lower than the 4,500 white commercial farmers who gave the country its agricultural spark before the land seizures. The destruction of the country's coffee and tea grain industry is testament to how quickly an economy can degenerate if key policy issues are not handled well. In 2017, Zimbabwe produced only 500 tons of coffee, with only about 3 of the once 150 strong commercial coffee producers productive today. This may well serve as a stark warning to South Africa as it ponders the best way forward regarding land reform. Here are 5 lessons to provide some direction on land expropriation, and if they're going to go ahead without compensation, if they don't follow these suggestions, their currency is cactus. South African currency is cactus, okay? And there's going to be huge amounts of starvation. Okay, the first, lesson number 1. Only give unutilized land to those who can really use it. Do not take land from active farms. This is lesson number 1 for South Africa. If land is to be taken, let it be given to those who have knowledge, the resources, and the desire to use it for its full purpose, i.e., don't give it to a bunch of Africans and let them put up shanties on it. That's crazy. This lesson also includes the aspect of order. There should be no room for chaos, but people should be given land fit for the purpose they want to use for it. It makes no sense to give land suited for crops to a farmer who wants to embark on cattle ranching. To set up communities on farmland, as suggested by Malema, completely destroys its purpose. While this might look like an example plucked from the blue, sadly that's what's happened in Zimbabwe, where farmers ploughed and applied fertilizers without any knowledge about the type of soil in use. Lesson number 2. Give farmers title to the land. Okay? The other mistake made in Zimbabwe, which should be a lesson for South Africa, was to take land out of the market. Following the land reforms in Zimbabwe, all land was said to belong to the state, like they're suggesting in South Africa, with farmers getting no title for the land that they would have been allocated. This meant that farmers were hamstrung and could not invest in meaningful infrastructure on a piece of land they could be chucked off at any time. Cases of several people being given an offer later for the same piece of land were rampant in Zimbabwe, with those with political muscle always winning. This obviously discouraged investment. Land without title also meant it could not be used for collateral, leaving the new farmers in need of adequate resources, stranded, as they could not borrow to capitalize and run the farming business. Giving land titles to new African owners means that banks will have to be party to this transaction by handing over the security they hold on loans to the government, which in turn means that any loans affected by this will be null and void for the simple reason that the banks created the money in the first place, based on the security provided, i.e. a title deed. Yes, banks do create money out of nothing. Here is a very interesting video which explains why money today in circulation has only debt backing it. Debt based on assets secured by the banks. Nedbank suggesting that landowners who are victims of land expropriation without compensation are still liable for the debt is talking bullshit, plain and simple. The rand is only fiat money, i.e. it's not backed by anything tangible like gold. Its value in global markets is determined by speculators who will take advantage of the chaos if land in South Africa is expropriated without compensation. The result will be a rand that quickly follows the path of the Zimbabwean dollar. Now, what I'm going to show you now is a video which actually explains to you just what fiat money is, and it's a great little video. It sets it out very clearly. Here we go.
Since 1971, when President Nixon took the United States off what was left of the gold standard, the world has operated under a system of money called fiat. The dollar, the pound, the euro are all government fiat currencies. Fiat is a Latin word meaning let it be so. It is the law that this government currency be money. Indeed, without that legal enforcement, and the fact that we must pay taxes in this money, that dollar bill or that computer digit that represents a dollar would be pretty much meaningless. Only the government has the power to issue fiat money, but banks can create it through lending. If somebody wants to borrow $10, a bank can create it from nowhere and lend it. It can then charge interest. Banks also create money by lending against an asset, such as a house. They're given the deeds to the house, and they create the money out of nowhere and lend it, at interest of course. Over the last 40 years, since this fiat system of money became the global norm, the supply of money has grown exponentially. In fact, we've seen the greatest growth in the supply of money in history. But who benefits? Of course, those that have the power to issue money, governments and banks. They haven't had to do anything productive, they just create money. Then those companies and individuals that get this money early. They can spend it before the prices of the things they want to buy have risen to reflect the new money in circulation. In other words, they get services, products, assets cheap. But prices soon rise, so holders of assets such as shares or houses will then see gains, without there necessarily being any improvements to the company or house in question. Often, this can lead to speculative bubbles. Who gets this money early? However money is created, be it through lending, fractional reserve banking, financial bailouts, or old-fashioned money printing, banks are always at or near the top of the money-issuing pyramid. Next come corporations who borrow large sums, those on lucrative government contracts for new ventures, particularly overseas, banks' associate companies and partners, those that borrow early and at low rates, and the bank's senior employees. They all quickly get their share of the pie. In some cases, this will come in the form of bonuses. But what about those at the bottom of the pyramid? Those on fixed wages or incomes, those who live in remote areas, or those with savings? By the time this newly created money has filtered down to them, the prices of the things they want to buy have increased. Their savings buy them less, however, and their wages remain largely unchanged. In some cases, they have to take on debt just to be able to afford the things they were previously able to buy, which means they have to go back to the banks. In reality, this process of creating money only redistributes wealth from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, and thus that ever-increasing gulf between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Okay, now that tells you basically what fiat money is. It's quite extraordinary when you get your head around it. Alright, lesson number 3. Property rights motivate the desire to succeed. Property rights, therefore, are not only prerequisites for the release of the funding that supports every farming activity, they are also the motivational stimulant to a farmer's determination to succeed. Whatever happens in South Africa, land should not be taken out of the market and title must be given as this is the only certainty that can activate the farmer and funders to pour in financial resources. Giving property rights to new African farmers raises a huge dilemma for the banks. How can a bank loan money to two different lenders who have no association using the same property as security? How can they try to enforce a preceding loan being paid by a farmer who previously owned the land before it was taken away from him without compensation? In short, they can't. That is double dipping. The huge debt banks have in the farming industry will collapse the entire South African banking industry. And if they start targeting residential property, roll on Zimbabwe. Remember, fiat money has nothing tangible backing it. And I suppose I should wear my Zimbabwe hat, shouldn't I? I don't think I can, not with this headset on, but roll on Zimbabwe. Okay, let's continue. Lesson number 4. Land has complex links to the whole economy. Now, this is a very, very important point. The responsible authorities also need to understand that land goes beyond farming, but is interlinked with the rest of the economy. Farming links feed into manufacturing in many food and non-food areas, from milk to textiles to tobacco, sawn timber, tourism, cardboard, and tissue paper. As Zimbabwean economist John Robertson put it in a paper entitled Strengthening Africa's Economic Performance, published in November 2017 by the Brenthurst Foundation, a key reason for the crash that destroyed Zimbabwe's manufacturing sector was the government's failure to recognize that commercial farming was an industry with complex links into every other industrial sector. Before a farm is expropriated, there is need to look at the whole value chain and appreciate that whatever we do on land will not disrupt upstream and downstream industries. Zimbabwe is currently importing more than half of its milk requirements from South Africa, but this has not always been the case. The country last year produced only 65 million litres of milk, against annual requirements of 120 million litres. This is the same country that used to produce about 300 million litres of milk back in the 1990s, before the dairy herd was destroyed after land reforms. Lesson number 5, and the final lesson. Bad moves wreak havoc further down the value chain. Using the milk example, there is nothing much to imagine, as the milk upstream value chain is immense. Industries and companies involved in the processing of milk-based products are threatened when the supply of raw milk becomes scarce. Jobs are lost as companies had to downscale while others closed. Then there is also the downstream side of the value chain, such as Zimbabwe's farming equipment was produced locally, including farming equipment such as plough discs, harrows, and planters. With the dairy herds gone, so too the consumers of stock feeds, veterinary services, vaccines, etc. The list is endless. This again leads to the loss of jobs and closures of companies. A drive around Zimbabwe's industrial areas will reveal a sorry sight of what was once thriving companies. Rusty factory shells line up the roads with no hope of coming back to life today. All because of one move: chaotic land expropriation. The dairy industry is just an example. You can take any crop plant to agricultural activity and appreciate the linkage with upstream and downstream industries. As South Africa embarks on the land expropriation road, it is to be hoped that the authorities and those leading the campaign will have full appreciation of what it means and make the right decisions. Zimbabwe is a good case study whose land reform pitfalls should not be repeated. And to take the Malema option will implode South Africa's economy and result in the rand fast following the Zimbabwe dollar's fate. What are the options for you today if you have rands in the bank and you want to protect its value? There are a couple, thankfully. The first one is to invest in physical gold, like the 1 ounce Kruger rands. Their value is based on the US dollar, so as the rand crashes, the same gold coin buys more rands because it's valued in US dollars.